Hello, today we're going to be going over the civil rights movement. So while the United States deployed troops around the world and many wars raged, such as the ones in Vietnam and Korea, on the home front, segregation based on race was enforced, and American lifestyle had changed to be suburban, and all Americans tried to live the ideal standard that they had been fed on TV.
The civil rights movement was an action brought from the local level to change policies on the national level. African Americans fought for equal rights and social justice through nonviolent protest for a long period of time. Eventually, laws were passed granting African Americans the right to vote and equal protection.
Keeping this information in mind, our thesis was the civil rights movement led to huge change in American society and had a lasting impact on people and government. African Americans fought for their civil and legal rights throughout the 1940s to 1960s and were able to bring their mistreatment to the attention of the whole country. After years of peaceful protests and demonstrations, the American government started to take action and granted African Americans their basic human rights, often through new legislation. However, tensions between the races and opposition of the equality of races still remained prevalent after the time period.
In 1942 Congress of Racial Equality. Attached at the bottom right corner is also a video that you can watch on your own to learn more about the organization. CORE was founded in 1942 by a group of racially mixed students in Chicago. The African American Civil Rights Organization helped lead the Montgomery bus boycott, freedom rides, and March on Washington. It's also important to know that the organization valued nonviolence, which is evident in their protest strategies. CORE worked with many civil rights leaders, like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, to end racial segregation in the nation.
One demonstration held by the CORE was the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides were set to challenge the precedent set by Boynton v. Virginia, which was a case that allowed for segregated bus terminals. In the Freedom Rides, the civil rights activists rode interstate highways in the segregated South to protest segregated bus terminals, and they used white-only bathrooms and lunch stools, even though the protesters were both white and African American. However, the rides were met with arrests from the police and violent counter-protesters, but soon enough, the protests caught on and it became a global phenomenon.
In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. The U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled the segregation of public schools unconstitutional because it went against the 14th Amendment. Under the 14th Amendment, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. It's also important to know that the court's ruling overturned the separate but equal doctrine established by Plessy v. Ferguson. Overall, the Brown v. Board of Education decision is important because it opened up doors for the desegregation of other public facilities.
(1963) March on Washington. The March on Washington was a march at Washington, D.C. in protest for equal rights, treatment, and opportunities for African Americans. At the march, there were over 250,000 people, and it was here where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, where he talked about the future where all men were equal. The march was huge and brought a lot of attention to the civil rights movement, and it was organized by King and his organization, the SCLS. 1964 Civil Rights Act. And here we have a video of Lyndon B. Johnson announcing the passing of the Civil Rights Act.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I want to take this occasion to talk to you about what that law means to every American. My fellow citizens, we have come now to a time of testing. We must not fail. Let us close the springs of racial poison. Let us pray for wise and understanding hearts. Let us lay aside irrelevant differences and make our nation whole. Let us hasten that day when our unmeasured strength and our unbounded spirit will be free to do the great works ordained for this nation by the just and wise God, who is the Father of us all. Thank you and good night.
The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964 after years of protests and demonstrations by Americans across the country. In the Civil Rights Act, segregation on the grounds of race, religion, or national origin were banned. Discrimination by employers or labor unions based on race, religion, or national origin were banned. The use of federal funds for discriminatory programs were banned, and the Department of Education was authorized to help in school desegregation. The Civil Rights Act was one of the biggest legislative achievements of the civil rights movement, and it laid the way for further civil rights laws like the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, the Civil Rights Act was like a second emancipation for African Americans.
The last event we're going to be covering is the 1967 case of Loving v. Virginia. So this case was a Supreme Court case, and it was between a colored woman, Mildred Jeter, and a white man, Richard Loving, and they were sent to prison due to them marrying each other. And the reason why is because they violated the Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924. And this act basically said that white people, well, generally there wasn't allowed interracial marriage, but generally white people couldn't marry other people of other ethnicities. However, Virginia argued that a more differential analysis should be applied because the statute punishes members of both races equally. Therefore, the action was justified. However, the act did interfere with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment as well as the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. This caused the Lovings to win, and it set the precedent that laws banning interracial marriage were unconstitutional all over the US, and this ended up affecting 16 states.